Good morning. Today is President's Day, February 20th. And there's a lot going on in the world, and I suppose the trade-off would be to talk about Ukraine or to talk about the earthquakes. And I selected to talk about the earthquakes and the spin-offs of that, and let the Ukraine situation stew for 2 weeks, and I'll talk about that the next time. President Biden was there. I think he's on his way to Poland. So there's lots to talk about both. But, major earthquakes. And for those of you who listened to the news today, Monday, another earthquake just struck 6.4 in the same region, rattling people who are living in tents and scaring the hell out of them because they're already victims of those two large earthquakes. How much damage the new earthquakes will make is too early to discern, at least from the news dispatches. But it's not just the earthquakes and the suffering of the people who are the victims, but the politics around the whole business that I want to talk about. And while I want to stress the international dimensions, allow me to start and say something about Turkey. Turkey is a country of 80-something million people. You have probably seen on the news that their President Erdogan, who started out as rather democratic, has become an autocrat and is up for re-election in May. He may postpone the election. And has in the recent years become incredibly authoritarian on the one hand, and on the other, completely raking over the economy by making major mistakes so that the Turkish economy is in considerable disarray. But what's relevant about him as an autocrat is, and it's an example not just of Turkey, but many countries, sooner or later, authoritarian governments surround themselves with yes men and or family members, in the case of Erdogan, and or people whose livelihood and political futures depend on the authoritarian leaders. And competence is often goes out the window. The man in charge of the Turkish government, who would have been in charge of managing this disaster, has absolutely no experience. He was a political appointment in anything having to do with disasters or anything pertaining to this kind of crisis. But as you no doubt read in the newspapers or heard on TV, part of the massive destruction in Turkey was the consequence, not just obviously earthquakes destroy things, but was also the consequence of a 99 earthquake in Turkey, which led to policies of new building regulations for new buildings. And those regulations are what was known at the time in terms of making buildings safer and to sustain earthquakes, and even if damaged, wouldn't collapse them. And because of the corruption in Turkey, many of the builders and contractors were given payoffs. And also the inspection systems did not work. So when they did shoddy work or work that was inconsistent with earthquake safety, the inspectors would be paid off or didn't show up at all to pass the inspection. And even at the more formal level, which is even more shocking, when buildings, and especially high-rises, did not meet the new earthquake requirements, you could, as a contractor or owner of the building, get amnesty for not meeting the criteria, and you would pay a little fine, but nothing happened to make the building safer. So part of the disaster, the human disaster, so far, I think 48 million people have lost their lives in Turkey. That number will probably continue to rise. And you've probably seen photos of high-rise buildings that were standing, and then in the middle of nowhere there was one that completely collapsed and pancaked. And so obviously humans can control earthquakes, but when you have corruption and when you don't have state-of-the-art building and inspection, especially of new buildings, you have a much bigger disaster on your hands. So the politics in Turkey is responsible for this disaster, or at least the magnitude of the disaster, of whole large modern, even luxury buildings completely collapsing because they did not meet the criteria because of payoffs and so forth. Now, on the Syrian side, both the Syrian part run by Assad has earthquake damage, as well as the part of Syria that is not under government control, under Assad control. And the bombings during the 12 years of war in Syria have done major damage everywhere in the cities of Syria. And many of the people who lived in the Syrian-run part of Syria, which has been damaged by the earthquakes, were already destitute, living in ramshackles and so on, and were more or less at the margins of starvation. There was one road that eventually was negotiated from Turkey into that part of Syria so that emergency food could be brought, and that was before the earthquake. And after the earthquake happened, the magnitude of what was needed obviously could not come in. First, the road was damaged for a couple of days. Then after the road was fixed, there was no way of getting in there from the Turkish side. So the disaster of modernity and new buildings in Turkey, and the disaster that was the consequence of the many years of war in Syria, have created this human disaster on both sides of the border. Now the question is, all right, so this major earthquake comes and millions of people are homeless and or killed. What about help? What about the international community? So the first question to ask is, what about Syria and the Assad regime? They were in the position to allow additional roads access to the earthquake-damaged part of the Syria that they don't control, and for days and days did refuse to open new passageways, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they are, not particularly anxious in helping their enemies. So then the question becomes, what about the international community? And so far, I've said there was a failure on the part of the Turkish government, a failure part of the Assad government, a war-torn country in Syria. And then you have the international community. What about them? Well, the first them maybe to worry about is the United Nations. Why is the United Nations, with all its capacity to help, not immediately present, throwing its weight into the human disaster with food and shelter and so forth? Well, in order for the United Nations to get activated, it has to go through the Security Council. And in the Security Council, Russia was very happy to veto the United Nations going into the destroyed areas. So you have a United Nations which in theory would have had the capacity to show up very quickly with lots of aid, having negotiate with the Assad regime on the one hand, and on the other press onto the Russians and their allies, the Iranians, of not blocking the United Nations coming in to help. So it took almost a week, almost 10 days, I think, for the United Nations to arrive in the non-government controlled part of Syria, to get additional roads to open, to get some level of cooperation and making some deals with the Assad government. Now, this has international and long-term consequences, because while the Assad regime is in bad shape and the country as a whole is in bad shape, the question is that, or the issue is that sanctions were applied during the war and after still ongoing conflict in Syria. And so Assad comes along and he says, well, I can't get the help we need because of the sanctions, forgetting that sanctions, even when sanctions are applied, they don't work, or they're not operational in case of human disaster. And that was argued about in the United Nations and got absolutely nowhere. Eventually, Assad made deals with various countries, Iran, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, even Saudi Arabia, to get help from them. And that has now changed the role of Syria in world affairs, because Syria was essentially blackballed by most countries, including the Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and now has made a deal essentially with them to get help. And the trade-off, of course, means that Assad got some kind of recognition and was able and is able right now to diplomatically network and get himself back into the sway of international affairs and alliances that he did not enjoy up until the earthquake. So in point of fact, the earthquake did not just shake up two countries, but it also has shaken up the dynamic of where Syria fits into the scheme of things. Now, Syria is not only destroyed and was not only isolated, and it now looks as if it will be less isolated, but of course millions of Syrians have also left Syria during the war. So Turkey had about 4 million Syrian refugees, the biggest group of Syrian refugees Turkey absorbed. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them lived in the earthquake area. And interestingly, the Turkish government has given them permission to go back to wherever they came from in government-occupied Syria for some months, and promised them that they can return as refugees to Turkey. So that's an interesting dynamic. As I say, a lot of Syrians who escaped government-controlled Syria and were in Turkey were allowed to go back to wherever they came from in non-earthquake areas of Syria, being promised by the Turks that they can, when they want to, they can return and become refugees in Turkey again. There are also a couple of million refugees strewn around on the other side of the Middle East, for example, Lebanon. Lebanon has a very large Syrian refugee population. I have not heard to what extent the Lebanese are allowing them to go back to wherever they come, with the promise that they can return to Lebanon. But Lebanon is in such a mess, and people are, even middle-class people, don't have enough to eat in Lebanon right now, given the political mess and the economic mess in Lebanon, which is a separate story which you need to talk about sometime. So it's doubtful that going back to mainland Turkey and returning to Lebanon is an option for those people. So you not only have a lot of homeless people, both on the Turkish and the Syrian side, but you also have a change in, or a moving of the checker pieces on the checkerboard in the Middle East, where the situation is so dire that countries wanting to help on the earthquake side have allowed Assad, who was considered to be persona non grata, to be interacting with them. And it's an interesting question as to what extent that will lead to Syria, Assad Syria, having having more permanent relationships with some of the neighbors that had not had anything to do with him for some years. So the earthquake not only has produced changes in the earthquake hit areas, but it has produced actual and potential changes in the dynamic of the relationships of countries in that part of the Middle East, and the role that Syria may be reintegrated, even with the Assad regime, to some extent with its neighbors. Now, the countries that have been helping the Assad regime, of course, have been all along has been Russia and Iran. Russia, of course, is busy in the Ukraine and is probably not wanting to, send a lot of resources into Syria right now, or even the government-controlled part of Syria, which is has been bombed and so forth during the war by the Russians, but is allied with the Syrian government. Not to mention helping the refugees from Syria that were in the non-government controlled part of Syria, which are so badly damaged. So dealing with this human catastrophe is deeply affected by the politics of the region. And what happens to all these millions of people who are now homeless, have no shelter, have no heat, and so on, is an open question. Now you might say, well, what about non-governmental organizations? Well, there are multiple pieces to that. The non-governmental organizations can only operate when they have access, right? So presumably they have access to Turkey or the Turkey-damaged parts of the earthquake. The Syrian non-government parts of Syria, they had no particular access to either because there was only this one road, and until the Syrian government allowed these other roads to be open, they couldn't send their trucks and so on. So the aid from the international non-governmental organization was in many ways very late in helping. Now, I do have a question about all of that, and I'm not sure I understand. I have tried to find out why it was that there weren't more airdrops, because theoretically, helicopters and planes and so forth could have taken off from Turkey and done airdrops over the affected area. Why that hasn't happened, I do not understand. And that's kind of a puzzle, because in many emergencies nowadays, even along the coast of California, God knows, and Highway 1, you can use helicopters to drop food, tents, and all the rest, and that did not occur. It's a puzzle. There is one non-governmental organization in the Syrian part of the affected areas that's not under government control, and these are the so-called white helmets, who are Syrians who've been helping in disasters throughout Syria. And I think there were almost 3,000 or more of those that immediately moved into the non-government controlled area of Syria and have been helping and gotten people out from under the rubble and helping in every imaginable way. But in the first few days, these guys were pleading. They all wear white helmets, by the way. These guys were pleading and saying, what we need is machinery. We need the tools to help dig out people. We don't have any of that. And again, the puzzle is, why did they not get airdrops of the tools and the machinery that they needed in order to dig people out from the rubble? It is a puzzle. So when the history of all of this is written, it seems to me that there are several levels of not only blame to go around, but puzzlements. First, why would a relatively modern state of Turkey allow the corruption in the building industry in known earthquake areas, where, after all, every few years there are earthquakes, not as serious as this one since 99 anyway, and one of these was stronger than the 99 one. Why did Turkey allow, through corruption, to allow buildings to go up, new buildings to go up, that would kill everybody in the buildings? So that's on Turkey. The second thing that then is a question is, why was it not possible for the international community to pressure Assad very quickly to allow emergency aid not only to come to his government-controlled part where the earthquake hit, but the other parts of Syria? And there the question is not just Assad, there the question is Russia and Iran, right? And that's on them, and that needs to be looked at. To what extent the Russians, who control much, also control a vote in the Security Council and stopped very quick aid from coming in. We're used to the fact that in emergencies nowadays, usually very quick help is available and can be marshaled. And this was not the case in this case. And it is both an ethical question, moral question. It's also an international political question that I think needs to be looked at, and no doubt will be looked at when the worst of the disaster and people who need help is examined. The other puzzlement is why it is that the Syrian government was not able to more quickly act in its Syrian area, perhaps because it doesn't have the capacity based on, all the decade more of warfare. But one of the puzzling questions about both the Turkish side of the earthquake damage and the non-Syrian government-controlled part of the earthquake side is why Erdogan and the Turks did not call in the military right away. They called in all kinds of, disaster relief individuals, but not the military. And Turkey has a very strong and capable military. As you probably know, Turkey is a member of NATO, and it has a lot of capacity. And why Erdogan did not mobilize the military right away to help his population and to help the various Syrian refugees in the non-government held part of Syria that was so badly damaged, I think is a puzzle and raises questions as to when people live in disaster areas, whether A, the military does not have to be competent to deal with civilian disasters, but B, why are there not automatic triggers to bring them into disaster areas? I mean, for example, in this country, when there's, major floods and damage and so forth, the National Guard can be activated and does get activated in various states. And National Guards and other military trained people in this country and other countries obviously have the capacity to to deal with situations in ways that civilians don't have the technology. And my impression from everything I've seen and read about the Turkish side was, and especially the Syrian non-government controlled side, was that the tools to try to rescue people were just simply not available. And it's simply not the case that those tools did not exist somewhere in Turkey. So that is a puzzle, because you've probably seen pictures on the television of people, digging for live people and bodies, essentially with their hands without any tools. So there are not only capacity issues that spin off of this disaster, but there are also government and international issues of why there was a slow response, a response often without the tools within the first few days, And in several areas, people didn't even get to individuals for 3 or 4 days. That's how badly the staffing was, the having the tools and capacity to deal with this. So what does one say about this? What one says about is that the international system has a huge capacity to deal with disasters, whether it's regional organizations or global organizations like the UN. And the question is, why are the abilities to mobilize those resources in a timely fashion stymied? And in the case of the United Nations, when the Security Council needs to act to activate things, then you can have vetoes, and that raises some serious questions. But even when the Security Council can be activated, why did help not come more quickly? Why did pressure not come more quickly? Where I'm asking was the UN. And I don't mean for the first day, but for days. And as I said, the excuse was there was no way to get in. But yes, there were no roads to get in until the Syrians allowed 2 additional roads to open and no trucks to get in. But why were there not airlifts, both for people and for technology? I don't understand it. Maybe you have some knowledge that I lack about it, but it is a puzzle. Now, again, what are the international spin-offs? The international spin-offs are that Turkey is a mess. Turkey is about to have an election. Turkey has been trying to sort of play both sides of the fence. On the one hand, it has sent some ammunition and drones and so forth to Ukraine. On the other hand, it has supported Russia and sent planes to them. So it has its mitts in both the NATO part and the European part, and as well as playing games with the Russians. What about all the neighboring countries? Well, many of the neighboring countries might not have sort of technological capacity, but they have resources and funds to help people. And so the question is, to what extent will food and food assistance and shelter and so forth be forthcoming from neighboring countries? And to what extent have these neighboring countries had to make a Faustian bargain with Assad? And of course, Assad is probably feeling very strong and good right now because countries that have not talked to him in eons are now talking to him, are dependent upon him to allow assistance into the country and passage through the country to earthquake-hit areas. And so Assad is probably thinking, okay, I've now joined the international community. And that too raises questions and is a problem. What does one say about the European Union, NATO, and on and on? Well, of course, everybody is busy in the Ukraine, right? But I want to spend the next couple of minutes saying something more about the United Nations. The United Nations as an organization is actually and potentially important, but it is stymied in many ways at this point, very bureaucratic. The quality of people who work there is not always first rate anymore. Many people are frustrated, and the General Assembly and the Security Council, especially the Security Council, can't budge because on the one hand, there's Russia and its veto. On the other hand, often nowadays, China joins in a veto. And even in terms of situations which are, let's say, Ukraine related and other countries related, many of the members of the Security Council are not necessarily voting in support of the Western and the United States, whether it's for Ukraine or other situations. How this can be changed, I do not know. But we in the United States pride ourselves that 50 countries in the world are supporting what we're doing in the Ukraine. Yes, well, there are almost 150 other countries that are not. Many of them are willing to say a nation's sovereignty ought to be respected, but they're not willing to get into the fray between the United States and Europe and Russia and China. And so part of the crisis of the earthquake and what to do about it has also exposed the fact that we are now in a multipolar world. And many of the third world countries or form of the poorer countries in the world are saying we're not getting into the mess. And finally, I think when from the perspective of poor countries, where their populations are starving, malnourished, don't have access to enough grain or food, whether it's due to civil wars, whether it's Ethiopia, or whether it's, a West African country or a Central African country, these countries are saying to themselves, when there's an emergency that impacts the West somehow in the United States, there is food aid and there is support. What about us? These millions of dollars that are being spent, billions of dollars, why aren't we getting some of it? So there is a kind of a psychological spin-off that has happened in the last, God knows, few years, both in terms of what's going on in the Ukraine, which I'll talk about next time internationally, but also what the earthquake response is here. If there's food available to help the disaster in Ukraine, what about the floods or the drought somewhere else? So the world, in a sense, is very messy at this point. Messy in a new way, in the sense of who is allied with whom. Messy in terms of large resources are needed due to climate change, to civil wars, now to earthquakes. And there seems to be no clear direction. So what the earthquake has exposed is not only the poor state of the situation of the Turkish government and the unpreparedness in a country that has lots of earthquakes and can expect earthquakes, and any kind of ethical judgment one ought to make about that. But it also has exposed that new institutions, new institutional capacity in the world is very much called for. And many, many political and economic questions need to be raised at the bilateral level for countries, especially for rich countries, but also in terms of allowing multilateral institutions like the United Nations, like regional organizations to function better. In any event, we're living through very difficult, and for that part of the world, and especially for Syrians, very sad times. But it's worth thinking not only in the short term, but also in the longer term. What has this exposed of new global needs and potential wants and potential malfunctionings in the international system? Thank you very much, and I'll talk about the Ukraine in a couple of weeks.